zero out, make the things more interesting. We're running 2 cameras. This one I have no extension to run from the electricity, so I must change batteries once in a while.
You want an extension cord?
No, it's the little gizmo that goes in here, like this here. See?
Oh, I see, and you don't have one?
No, I just bought that camera from a fellow second-hand, and he didn't have that part. So.
Oh, okay. Well, so you have to swap batteries.
Yeah, that's right. So every once in a while I'll stop to.
Okay, before we get started, just let me read this, just
yes.
to make this all just real, appreciate this so much. This is beautiful. He says, he's talking about his policy, or Germany's policy in Eastern Europe.
Right.
And he says, it is only natural that their understanding of foreign politics should suffer. He's talking about candidates for the party who come from a political background, a conservative background. He says, such being the case, it is only natural that their understanding of foreign politics should suffer from the prejudice and inadequate knowledge of those circles to which they were formerly attached by political and ideological ties.
That's right.
And this is true not merely of the men who come to us from the left. On the contrary, however subversive may have been the kind of teaching they formerly received in regard to these problems, in very many cases this was at least partly, here it is, here's the power phrase, this was partly counterbalanced by the residue, of what? Of sound and natural instincts which remained in them.
That's right.
In such cases, it is only necessary to substitute a better teaching in place of the earlier influences in order to transform the instinct of self-preservation and other sound instincts into valuable assets. On the other hand, it is much more difficult, now we're talking about the conservative types, the
That's right, yeah.
hip, hip, hooray, I'm for free enterprise, chamber of commerce types.
Yeah, right. The Kivanis one.
Yeah.
Freemasonic type, yeah.
Yeah, it's right. It is much more difficult to, he's talking about these guys now, it's much more difficult to impress definite political ideas on the minds of men whose earlier political education was not less nonsensical and illogical than that given to the partisans of the left. These men have sacrificed the last residue of their natural instincts to the worship of some abstract and entirely objective theory. It is particularly difficult to induce these representatives of our so-called intellectual circles to take a realistic and logical view of their own interests and the interests of their nation and its relations with foreign countries. Here it is. This is so beautiful. God. Their minds are overladen with a huge burden of prejudices and absurd ideas, and they have lost or renounced every instinct of self-preservation. With those men, also, the National Socialist movement has to fight a hard battle. And that's what Denny Minion did.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
And the struggle is all the harder because, though very often they are utterly incompetent, they are so self-conceited that without the slightest justification, they look down with disdain on ordinary common-sense people. These arrogant snobs who pretend to know better than other people are wholly incapable of calmly and coolly analyzing a problem and weighing its pros and cons, which are the necessary preliminaries of any decision or action in the field of foreign politics.
Very good.
Isn't that beautiful?
Yep.
You know, and page after page after page.
1924.
Yeah, that's right.
Imagine that, eh?
Yeah. So I thought that was interesting, and people say, you read Mein Kampf, how could you get through it? And I says, how can you not get through it? It's so exciting, it's deep and penetrating and ideologically substantive, you know, so.
See? Good thing that I already came in, but this is already a couple of things. Okay. I am,
How do you want me to sit?
just like the way you are, change nothing.
Say something.
I'm in San Diego, California. I'm with Bill Martin. Bill Martin is a very interesting man with a very interesting story and even more interesting enterprise and career. And we are going to interview him about an even more interesting man, an American professor of Hungarian descent who taught here in California at universities. And he taught what?
He taught astronomics, he taught astrophysics and mathematics.
And he is the most famous for what?
He is the innovator of the theory of freedom as well as the theory of volitional science and many other theories.
Explain to us what volitional science means.
Well, first of all, the concept or the word volitional pertains to the word volition, and volition refers to the ability to make choices. So that is the first term. And science is organized knowledge. And so this is an interesting theme because for the first time in the history of the world, we have an integrated science that refers to volitional interactions. This has never happened before. There have been approximations to it, there have been attempts at it, but nobody has ever succeeded.
The ordinary person, could they equate volitional with voluntary?
Well, yes, they could, but the term voluntary is, let's put it this way. All voluntary action is volitional, but not all actions are voluntary.
Okay, in this professor's concept then, where is he different from what we have right now in the Western world? Why is his teaching so different that you would devote your life to bringing it to the public in an organized way? From what I understand, you are the literary executor, can we call you that?
That's true.
Of his work, and there is somewhat, how many thousands of pages of manuscripts did that man leave behind?
By the time we're finished with his theories of freedom and primary property, which generally would be referred to as a theory of volition, we will have about 7,000 pages and 7 volumes.
And those are really condensations of much larger amounts of notes that he has
Not
given
really.
lectures, no?
No, this will be a unique publication of a very great scientist's work. He never did write any of his theories out. Fortunately for the world and for us, he recorded all of his lectures on reel-to-reel tapes. And we have been able to transcribe the material on those tapes down to the last syllable. And from those transcripts, edit very sparsely what he said, and organize it in a way that reads very rationally and very elegantly, I should say.
Did you avoid duplication? Because invariably there would be duplications. Did you try to avoid duplications in his lectures? That you wouldn't find, let's say, in page 230,
Not at
the
all.
same as you have in page 670.
That's right. Not at all, because Professor Galambos always said that that repetition is the mother of learning, and it's a very effective pedagogical tool. So no, we did not. And sometimes when the sentences would appear to be run-on, we would not try to rewrite that or paraphrase it at all. We would simply put a comma in here and there, and the beauty of it was that after a while we found out that this had its own unique style, and it was cumulative. And we found also that when you read the transcripts of his live lectures, you had a profit from it that was an example, in the sense that you remembered so much more. So I think it's a bit of serendipity. We have here a chance to produce to the world something that is of the caliber of Principia Mathematica by Newton, where you're actually almost there, present, live in his lectures.
With the man himself.
Yes, the man himself. Professor Galambos often said that it is not enough to teach the content of a theory. You have to also teach its history and its philosophical basis, which made it possible. Well, here we get it all. We get the historical background, we get the man, as you say, and all the flavor of that, along with the beautiful philosophical basis that supports and justifies and renders valid all of his great scientific principles that make it possible for man someday to be completely free for the first time.
You met him how and when?
1964, September 28th. I'll never forget the night. He was delivering the second session of his great course, Capitalism, the Liberal Revolution. As it turned out, that was the final name for it. He didn't dare tell his market that was the name of the title, because capitalism scared away all the liberals, liberal scared away all the capitalists, and revolution scared off everybody else. So he just simply called it Course 100, later to be called V50, which was his theory of freedom, in which he gives the basic philosophical basis for all that followed. But the title of the lecture was How Do You Know You Were Right? So I thought that was a very philosophically provocative title, and so I signed up for the course, and I took notes that evening, and after about, maybe 10 minutes or so, my notes had no more, what do you call them, doodles, and it was straight note-taking, because I was learning the semantics of science for the first time.
In what university was that?
It was not the university. Galambos founded the Free Enterprise Institute, or its more formal name is the Liberal Institute of Natural Science and Technology. And
So it was not a credit course that you took?
no, in one sense, yes, in another. Professor Galambos said that he wasn't accredited like UCLA or USC, but then again, he didn't consider them sufficiently accredited to get any similar designation from himself.
Mm-hmm.
He had a very unique attitude about education, taught that the subject was basically the transmission of absolutely right concepts to those who could understand them and derive them, and who furthermore would go out and live them and apply them in the real world, which he defined as the world which is derived from rationality and morality.
Now you
Both of
must-
those terms being defined absolutely.
You were a very young man then.
I was 28 years old,
Mm-hmm.
and I was on fire with the quest for knowledge. I had read the Greeks and the Romans and the medieval writers and all the classical narrators of the great novels. I'd read Shakespeare and Milton and Byron and Donne and Keats and Shelley, just what every young man who thirsts for meaning in life would do. And so I was pretty well primed for this. I was unbelievably unhappy with the state of the world at the time. I knew that the United States, when I was 28, I knew that the United States was doomed politically. It could never recover. And it was no longer a republic, it was a political democracy, which is a euphemism for a welfare state. I did not know at that time exactly what had caused that. I suspected conspiracy because even then I was intuitively recognized that society had a natural spontaneity to it. I'd learned a little bit about the theory of spontaneous order, which is that the beautiful, synergistic, self-adjusting, glorious, evolutionary nature of society is the unintended result of countless selfish actions, and that if left alone, mankind or society or those within society would be able to innovate the necessary protective agencies to satisfy the universal demand for the protection of private property. Property meaning, in Galambos' case, an individual's life and all of the derivatives of his life. The understanding that you can't own your children.
So
And that
actually,
includes intellectual property, which is the most important form of property, which he called primary property, which he defined in turn as thoughts, ideas, and actions.
so that saying, the proverb that the pupil was ready when the master appeared, was
Absolutely.
true in your case.
That's absolutely true.
In other words, you had the proper kind of preparation, soul-wise and
Yes,
intellect-wise.
yes. I had a sense of the significance and, if you will, the romance of Western civilization. And I knew that there was a great heritage here and that it had foundered. Why? I did not know. I was soon to learn as I sat at the feet of this great innovator who pointed out that when you really were to reduce it down to a single word, it was coercion. And that's the problem. And if you postulate coercion in your attempt to formulate a durable society or any kind of society, nature will ultimately repeal it. And that was a major breakthrough, unbelievably revolutionary. But I would say my first big eye-opening idea that I heard was when Professor Galambos said on that fateful night of September 28, 1964, that he was talking about the concept of importance, and he discussed the great Roman general Marcus Marcellus, who during, I believe it was the Second Punic War, was having a hard time taking Syracuse. And it turned out that Syracuse had a national defense which consisted of, I think, a 75-year-old man whose name happens to be Archimedes. And Archimedes, was the innovator of the lever and of hydrodynamics and hydrostatics and mechanics and mathematics. And he even wrote a book called The Sand Reckoner, which dared to calculate how many grains of sand there are in the universe. And Archimedes had been able to lift Roman ships out of the water. They couldn't get into the harbor with big derricks. Big catapults would rain down boulders and smash the ships. And even he focused the rays of the sun on the hulls of their ship and burnt them up. An experiment that Parade magazine said had been repeated at the very site by some professor somewhere in Italy, I believe. The amazing thing was that he was killed, by the way, by a Roman soldier during a religious drunken festival. Never bodes well for protection. The Romans got in and stabbed him when he was working with his mathematical circles on a sand table. And Archimedes said, don't bother me. Don't mess with my circles. And the soldier ran him through and killed him, against the orders of his commanding general, by the way, because they had that much respect for Archimedes. And I say all this because, Professor Galambos said, if you define importance as the measure of the effect, total measure of the effect upon property, and if you define property as an individual's life and all of the derivatives of his life, including his thoughts, ideas, actions, and all tangible derivatives, with the understanding that you cannot own your offspring because they too possess these characteristics, then you can say that at the time, Archimedes was not so very important. Not nearly as much as Marcus Marcellus, who could take whole cities. He was a great general. He affected a hell of a lot of property in the world. But then came the great question, and I'll never forget this. He said, how many of you in the audience remember the name of Marcus Marcellus? And not one person knew. And then he asked for a show of hands. How many of you know the name of Archimedes? And every hand raised. It was raised. And he says, do you find that a significant response to my question? And do you find my question interesting? He says, why is it that the importance of Archimedes has evolved over the millennia? And Marcus Marcellus, who was a great conquering general's importance, vanished after his death. Or to take another case, do you think that the people in Asia and Eastern Europe were worried about the activities of Genghis Khan and his successors in the year roughly 1200? You bet they were. You bet they were. And then he asked the question, how many of you worry about his activities today? Nobody could say they did. So then he asked this great question. He said, tell me, could you say that a man's importance dies with him, as it did with Genghis Khan? And most of the people in the audience weren't thinking, I guess. And they said, well, yes, of course. And Galambos says, then how do you explain the importance of Archimedes' achievements? His name is on the lips of every schoolboy. And so then I got to learn that night the difference between relative and absolute importance. That was the first great big idea I had ever heard in my life. And I began to see that history could be recorded in two different ways. In one case, you could glorify the actions of those who were very important in their lives, but whose importance vanished afterwards because their importance was relative. Or on the other hand, which is rarely done, very rarely taught, you could chronicle the achievements of men whose importance, their ability to affect property, did not die with them, but grew inexorably over the centuries and millennia. And with that stated that night, as a 28-year-old man, I said to myself, I'm hearing something here that is more philosophically provocative and profound than I've ever heard in all my life, and I better start listening hard here. The next question was, well, then what is it that makes absolute importance absolute? Great question. And he answered. It was a rhetorical question. And he answered and he said, it's the scientific method. The scientific method is what all of these achievements have in common. And I then really listened in, and I learned that the scientific method consists of 4 steps. Basically, they are observation for the purpose of data gathering, hypothesis formulation, extrapolation, and again, observation, but this time for the purpose of the corroboration of the extrapolations. And if the downstream derivatives of this method are found to have no exceptions, then you know that you are absolutely right. And that's in the physical domain. The next week I listened to his next session, which taught that in order to apply this marvelous method, which has been so supremely successful in positive history, in the history of physics, the history of science, to the domain of volition, it would be necessary that we add another parameter, which in this case was morality, which was not a mystical concept, but one which was derived from proprietary or observable criterion. He came up with a definition of property. From property, he defined coercion. He defined coercion as any attempted intentional interference with property. And then the word which was on the shelf for the absence of coercion was morality. He fetched it off the shelf and gave it an absolute designation. And then with that as one of his postulates, namely that all moral frameworks of reference are equally valid for the pursuit of happiness. Each one of these definitions not being flimsy, but very rigorously defined and observably determined. And the other postulate being that all volitional beings live to acquire property or pursue happiness, an unexceptional one. Even the masochist and the suicide do not violate that postulate. And from those two postulates, he was able to derive the concept of freedom, which he defined as the societal structure that exists wherein each individual is in 100% control over his own property and therefore 0% control over anybody else's property. And he could also, with the same postulates, refute every single experiment that man has ever had in the attempt to bring about freedom, namely all of the ideologies and isms of statism and also of religion, which he designated respectively as secondary mysticism or secondary property mysticism, politics, and primary mysticism, which is religion. And he gave it a rational Newtonian basis. And for the first time in history, 300 years out of home port, which is Newtonian 300 years ago, man now has the additional third parameter necessary for building freedom. An interesting use of the verb build. We don't fight for freedom, we don't donate for freedom, we don't march for freedom, we don't pray for freedom. It has to be built like any other product. That in itself was a hugely revolutionary concept to me. And I said, well, wait a minute now. I said, we've now got an alternative here to the old historical, the dilemma. Either you have, on the one hand, anarchy, or on the other hand, you have statism. And that's always historically been the case. Once the focused coercion attenuates and dissipates, you wind up with anarchy, which is much worse, out of which emerges either spontaneously a new system of things, or it is more tyranny, even worse tyranny. So now, for the first time in history, we had a third alternative, which was derived from the great examples that the history of science had been able to bring us, that virtually everything we desire and everything that we consume that makes it possible for us to survive has come from the great achievements of the great physicists in history. The trouble is that now mankind was facing, as Professor said, a terminal crisis, because man now knew enough from science to produce the technology to wipe us out as a species and lacked the necessary technology to prevent that from happening. And his theory fills the gap here and makes it possible for the tremendous achievements of science to come to their proper fruition. And in the process, there will be technologies innovated which will make it absolutely impossible, eventually, for criminals to seize control locally and then ultimately universally. They will not be able to function in a world that is so rationally conceived and so proprietarily incentivized and marketed that we can truly say crime does not pay. You cannot get people to be moral by thumping pulpits. That he taught us. The only way you're ever going to be able to revolutionize the world is through exactly the same process, for example, that we got the television set, or anything in the electronics world today. which is an interesting story. May I share it with you just shortly? In 1864, an obscure Scottish mathematician and physicist by the name of James Clerk Maxwell was able to put together 4 different equations, I understand, which integrated light, magnetism, and electricity in one single, elegant, unified whole. Well, nobody understood what he was talking about. He never got a market of so much as one person. And what happened is he died. And shortly after his death, a German by the name of Heinrich Hertz, a great physicist, was able to understand what Maxwell had done, and he became Maxwell's market of one. And that market of one, talk about leverage now. We've been talking about Archimedes, now we come back here. We see another concept of leverage. Maxwell was able to propagate what was called an electromagnetic wave across the room where he was teaching a class. And it was registered, I believe, on a galvanometer, and a little deflection, a little movement took place, and that was the birth of the radio wave. Maxwell didn't fare much better. I mean, Hertz didn't fare much better. And shortly after his death, I guess, I'm not sure about that, but about 1901, I think it was, an Italian comes into the picture. His name is Guglielmo Marconi. And Marconi takes and applies the Hertzian wave on a big scale. He propagates a wave from his transmitter on New Year's Day, I think it was. And it went all the way across the Atlantic Ocean and was recorded in Newfoundland just a microsecond later. And then we can ask this question: how many people in the world knew anything at all about this earth-shaking history here? A handful. But I'll tell you this, the White Star Shipping Line in 1912 launched a great ship called the Titanic, the sister ship or the brother ship to the Olympic, and on its maiden voyage, on April 12th, I believe it was, that year, it struck an iceberg, and we all know the story. It went down beneath the waves, but not before its wireless operator, a phenomenon, a position that had never existed before in history, sent a message which was picked up by a vessel called the Carpathia, and its heroic captain, a maximum man, was able to get the position of the Titanic without a wire, without telegraphs, and got to the scene of the tragedy at about just before dawn, and they saved 750 people, I believe. And this was the first commercial application of Maxwell's equations. Now this was starting to hit the big time, because now we have a big, very visible public corporation that's buying the downstream product of Maxwell's esoteric equations. Hell, just 10 years later, we were into the radio age birth. And then when I was a kid in 1944, my father got an Admiral television set, and I remember watching the lifeguards on the beach in Los Angeles, and Harry Owen's Hawaii Calls, and oh my Lord, that was great in the World Series. It was beautiful things. Speed of light, this miracle was taking place in my living room. And the moral of the story is that in less than 100 years, the world had been revolutionized without ever having any need to be educated, because we bought our television set on the basis of images and slogans, not on ideology. The ideological penetration, such as occurs in books like this that I'm working on for the Professor, it's only necessary to reach a few. Most people think you have to reach the masses to educate them. They're absolutely wrong, and history does not support this at all. What history supports is the story I'm telling you. You can generalize it to everything, including the theory of freedom here. First, the esoteric knowledge has to be promulgated. After it's promulgated and read and digested and understood by a few powerful, dedicated intellectuals, revolutionaries, in the truest sense of the term, then downstream prototypes of products can come out. And then those products can be mass-produced. And then they're sold to images and slogans by salesmen, essentially. And the masses, you can count on it. They will consume these products if it enhances their pursuit of happiness, postulate number one, better than the primitive alternatives before. I mean, let's face it, we never had to pass any laws to force people to consume the automobile. The old buggy whip in a carriage, you know, went out without any need to outlaw it or to create a war or kill anybody in the process. And that's very exciting, exceedingly optimistic news for a world out there here that should be starving for this kind of revolutionary knowledge to complement whatever else they're learning on this site. And I think that's why you're here.
Let me ask you, how will it affect the common man? How will it affect future societies if they begin to understand and adopt this kind of thinking?
Yeah, they won't ever understand this thinking, that's for sure, which I just said. But they will understand intuitively that something behind the marvelous products they're getting that will now allow them to satisfy their need for protection of their property. They will gravitate quite naturally to it, and it will affect them in this way. It will set them free for the first time in human history. And ultimately, the destiny is cosmic. Man is not limited to this planet. He's not confined to this solar system. This is our ancestral home. We've made a hell of a mess of it so far. But yeah, man's cosmic destiny can... I guess I probably could tell you the story, if you want to go way out here, is that let's look down the road a few thousand years from now, or maybe more, maybe less. You could have a father that's standing with his son, and he's looking out across the starry spaces, and he looks at a spiral galaxy, and he has a fantastic equipment at his hand, and he has his boy look through it, and he says, "You see that spiral arm in that galaxy out there? It used to be called the Milky Way. Now we call it the Bruno Galaxy, for he was the one that expanded man's view of the cosmos beyond this miserable Earth, and was burned alive for it in February 19th, 1600, by the way. And he too is triumphant, like Archimedes. And the boy will look, and he will see the spiral arm. The father will say, "Well, there's a star out there, about 2/3 of the way out in that spiral arm in that distant galaxy." And they'll be looking at Andromeda, probably 1,000,000 light years away, I think. And he'll say, "You cannot see that G dwarf 0, very common, ordinary little star. It used to be called the sun, my son, but it's now called Copernicus." And a third star out from Copernicus, there's a little small planet. It's now called Aristarchus, after Aristarchus of Samos, who was the contemporary of Archimedes, who first taught us this. And though you cannot see that, my son, because of the theory of freedom, it was innovated in the 20th century, 300 years and some change after Newton's great Principia, and derivative of that book, because of that theory, we are here today. And my son, that is our ancestral home. That's what's at stake here, to answer your question. I took you way out there, but yes, that's what's in it for the human species. And they will also find that if there is any such thing as a bureaucrat left on this planet who wishes to come and tax him, he will be able to say to the bureaucrat, if one even exists, he'll be able to say, "Mr. Bureaucrat, you are not welcome. You wish to plunder me in my own best interests, and let me tell you something, I have my best interests at stake always, because there is a voluntary society we live in here. We are all free. You're a relic of the past, and I'm going to ask you politely to leave my property, and if you don't, if you pull out a gun, well, you will cease to be a problem." And he can make that statement stick. So you see, the whole problem of mankind is he has always been in a paradigm of mysticism, either primary or secondary in its effect. And he has always repeated the errors of the past because he never realized where the real action was. The real action was in the world of physics. And the epistemology, or the philosophy of physics, I'll just share this quickly with you, and this is all in his works, which the readers of the future will be able to come and get their nourishment from. And it will enhance their effectiveness and their depth and their dedication as revolutionaries. Consists of, first, semantic precision. Most people have no semantic precision at all. They don't know where they speak, and therefore their goals are flimsy and foggy, and they are therefore pursuing that which is or that their course of action is consistent with that. They're inconsistent. They fail. So you have to have semantic precision, first of all. I think it was Voltaire who said, if you wish to speak to me, define your terms. In Newton's Principia Mathematica, he begins with definitions. These are wonderful precedents. Politicians throw words around as though they're on the house, and that's why they can't succeed in anything they do. And the second step, the second part of philosophy, which is all important, is the scientific method, as I mentioned before. It is the only method for successfully organizing knowledge. There is no other. The third great principle of philosophy is Occam's razor, named after the great Oxfordian theologian of the 14th century, who said, the essentials must not be multiplied beyond necessity. In other words, you eliminate the extraneous matter and you strive for simplicity, for, as he said, God favors simplicity. And history will support that. As a matter of fact, Copernicus, or Galileo, was asked, why did you pick Copernicus over Hipparchus? Why did you pick the Copernican sun-centered universe over the earth-centered universe of the Ptolemies? And his answer was, well, because Copernicus's hypothesis is simpler. That is to say, it had fewer essentials or fewer postulates. And even though it went against observable evidence, it didn't matter, because more could be explained with less. And lo and behold, when Newton came along with his three postulates, now we've gone from 95 postulates of the Hipparchan scheme of things down to about 45, I've been told and read, for Copernicus, and Newton reduced it to 3. His first law of motion, his second law of motion, and his universal law of gravitation. And with those 3 fundamental, observably corroborable postulates, he was able to derive the system of the world, and from that came the modern age. You have to ask yourself the question, how did people get around before Newton? The answer is they walked. If they were wealthy, maybe they had a horse-drawn carriage or something like that. How did people get around? How do people get around today? Well, they get around this way. Cars, airplanes, rockets, you name it. It's unbelievable. Second question, how did people light their homes before Newton? Answer, they didn't. The only light they had was the sun. I understand there was the Lunar Society in Scotland. Great physicists up there used to have meetings under the full moon because they could see their way to the meeting place and see their way back home. But people didn't have any light in their homes, basically. And after Newton, with the flip of a switch, we can light a city. Next question would be the third one. It would be, how do people communicate with each other in the old days? Well, they had a distance, they yelled. Beyond that yelling distance, they didn't. There wasn't any paper. Or carrier pigeons, some hotshot once said to me. I says, okay, big deal, so that's an exception to the deal. But don't nitpick me. The point is, people didn't communicate at all, really, at any distance, except by voice, the sound of voice. How do people communicate today? Television, radio, telephone, you name it. It's beautiful. All right, now you have to answer the question. For all of recorded history, man was in a condition of stasis here. It was static. There wasn't any progress in these 3 industries that I've talked about. After Newton, when man knew how to use the scientific method to resolve his differences, to use Occam's razor, the criterion of simplicity, and to use semantic precision, with these great, incredible philosophical tools, these enormous levers, this enormous capital, man was able to go out and create the modern world of technology and science. It's not an accident. It's hugely exciting. It's revolutionary. And it's about time for mankind to take and learn from the lesson and apply whatever they were doing there to the condition of society. Instead of trying to resolve their differences by majority vote, winning beauty contests, and wielding coercion either through fraud or through force. So that's those 3 portions of philosophy. And the fourth one would be that you pursue knowledge for its own sake. You find somebody that doesn't want to pursue knowledge for its own sake, they're only interested in how they can make more money with what you're teaching them, you can pass them by. They'll never build freedom. They'll never be revolutionaries. So that's a characteristic of a true philosopher. By the way, philosophy means love of wisdom. Wisdom would be the rational and moral or the right application of knowledge. Knowledge being defined as the interaction between the observer and the observed, and that interaction takes place in the brain. And I'm just giving you some of the semantics of this marvelous theory, which is Newtonian through and through, with one addition, which is huge, which makes Galambos, I think, the most significant integrator in the history of mankind. Certainly, when he was alive, the most important man on the planet. And that additional input is morality. Morality being anchored not religiously on divine revelation, but on a proper concept of property, which again is defined as an individual being's life and all of the derivatives of that life. And I believe that that is observable. It is absolute in the sense that it is not subject to arbitrary determination. It is the same. When you look at that definition and utilize it, the observer will get the same result, irrespective of time, place, and circumstance. And science is built up of absolutes. Just for the edification of your audience, an absolute is a human opinion, which after the use of the scientific method produces results that are universally corroborable, irrespective of time, place, and circumstance. Example, Galileo's law of falling bodies. He had an opinion how they fell, and how fast they fell. And that has been tested, I don't know, maybe billions of times. And it doesn't matter whether you're an Italian or a German or an Irishman. It does not matter where you live or when you live. If you will test Galileo's opinion, you will get the same result that he had. That makes that opinion an absolute. Of course, you know in today's degenerate and defective society, which is committing suicide at a rate that's it's unbelievably frightening. Everybody is taught in the gun-run schools today that everything is relative. And for those in your audience who ever run into that or think that themselves, let them ponder the absoluteness of the statement, which contradicts it. If everything is relative, so is the statement, but we've gotten nowhere. I remember my sociology teacher at Oregon State in 1953. I only lasted in that class for about 1 hour. And I had a big Donnybrook with the professor right in front of the class. He said everything is relative and knowledge, there is no absolutely knowable knowledge or something like that. Knowledge is that there is no, you cannot have absolute knowledge. And I said, well, if that's the case, then what you just said is incomprehensible and useless. Why do we bother? Is this what sociology is anchored upon? Is that one of your postulates? And he thought I was a troublemaker, so we had a meeting after class and we both agreed that I shouldn't take the course and he shouldn't teach it. So that was the end of that. That was the beginning of the end of my college days, which was like from the very beginning. By the way, a professor defines education as the successful transmission of absolutely right concepts and how they're derived to those who can understand them and apply them to the real world. The real world is not the world derived from politics, because nature has repealed every one of those experiments. The real world is not hocus pocus and religious incantation that leads to wars and internecine death. The real world is the world that squares up with what we get from the scientific method, and now from moral behavior added to it. With those great philosophical principles, we're able to, for the first time in human history, we're able to actually build the requisite technologies, which in their aggregate will gradually overtake the powers of the world to coerce. And then we will have the flight of the bureaucrats. And that will be what Marx said, of all things, for the wrong reasons, of course. But he said, the state will wither away. How prophetic. He did not know how to do it. He had nothing but communism to offer, which is the repeal. It violates the first postulate of Galambos' theory. And it certainly violates his second postulate. I repeat, the first postulate is universal. It's a law of nature, is that all men live to pursue their happiness. Now, their happiness can be irrational. It can even be pursued immorally. It doesn't matter. But every man pursues what he construes to be a higher preference of existence than the one he's got now. Any way he slices it, that is true. Now that's a universal statement of the ultimate nature of man. You can't build freedom with that. But if you add to that the second postulate, which is that all moral frameworks of reference are equally valid for the pursuit of happiness, or put another way, all concepts of happiness pursued through non-coercive behavior are equally valid, that is to say, acceptable logically for us to be able now to derive the concept of freedom, the societal structure in which there is no coercion. We have that. Now, coming back to the philosophy, I've mentioned semantic precision, use of the scientific method, Occam's razor, knowledge for its own sake. But there's another very important parameter here to philosophy. And most philosophy teachers, most professors of philosophy, the universities don't know second about the subject. I learned it from this great philosopher. And it was a Newtonian, and following in the footsteps of Newtonian in physics. But it is this principle. You have to take into consideration that which is unseen, as well as the seen, in every intellectual deliberation. In other words, you have to take into consideration not the immediate and the specific consequences of something, but also the long-term general effect on, let's say, sociologically, all people, all peoples. And if you don't take that into consideration, you're unfit to discuss the issue rationally, which is the case of the politicians. The politicians will say, well, isn't this a great thing, this tax we're raising here? We're going to build dams. We're going to build this bridge. Look at all the jobs we've created. Well, sure, that's appealing to the dimwit. He'll look at that and say, oh, God, this guy's a real humanitarian. He doesn't realize that what the price is to everybody else that has to pay for that, universally. And until you can trace the unseen effects of that policy and can see their economic results and compare them to the advantages here, you're not in a position to rationally discuss that issue. And philosophy, the philosophy of science, tells you that you have to take into consideration the long-term and general consequences of something, as well as the short-term specific consequences. I mean, if you don't do that, you're a charlatan. You are a misnomer. You're not a lover of wisdom. You're a fraud. And then, of course, there's the final now brand new and revolutionary addition to the subject of philosophy, which no one until now has ever been able to exercise, and history corroborates this, because all we've ever had in history is the decline and fall of blank. You tack on your favorite country, and our own is a case in point. Shall I say this? How can I emphasize the magnitude of this late addition to the subject of philosophy, without which there is no hope for mankind? None. Absolutely none. Because we have the ability to destroy ourselves, and we don't have the ability to prevent that from happening. We have a doomsday machine. We have, for the first time, a non-theological, non-science fiction doomsday machine where the body of the science of the world is controlled by the brain of a Frankenstein, the collective, insane minds of political opportunists and those who are behind them. So, this final addition is, it's all important, is morality. It is not enough to exercise a scientific method, semantic precision, Occam's razor, the quest for knowledge for its own sake, the taking into consideration the unseen as well as the seen, and all that, if it leads to the world we have today, where science is the slave of gangsters. We have to have a postulate that you always go by in the derivation of the institutions which will do away with the coercion of the world. And that postulate is morality, the second postulate, which is, again, a non-theological, non-mystical postulate. It's, for the first time, it's very philosophically unique in that, in science, always before, postulates were generalizations of natural phenomena. They could be observed. They could not be derived. They were assumed. It was a product of inductive science, not deductive science. It was induced, I repeat that, induced. And you must always keep that open for refutation. You can't derive its necessity. You have to assume it. But it has millions and millions upon millions of corroborations with no known exceptions, so the probability is asymptotic, that it will never be, it will not be. You can count on it, you can bet your life on it, both individually and collectively. The second postulate of volitional science truly is a principle, in the sense that it is distinguished from the law of nature, in the sense that it is what should be. Not what is, but what should be. That does not mean it's impossible to abide by it and get what you want. The beautiful thing about this is that if you use it and it comes to prevail, then there will be exceptions. And it will become a statistical law of nature and graduates from a principle to a law. So that is basically what the theory of volitional science is about. That's why I've dedicated my life to it. And I think within a single generation it will be possible for products to come out that will be so potent technologically in the protection of private property that a new majority will exist for the first time in human history. And that new majority will be that the majority of the world's products will come through the technologies of this that are derived from all that I've been talking about, that are in these books. And when that happens, freedom, as I defined it, as Professor Galambos defined it, will become a fait accompli. And mankind for the first time can have a cosmic destiny. That's what he was born for. So that's sort of a long-winded, discursive answer to your question, but
let me ask you, you've got 7,000 pages here. There are not very many Bill Martins in the world that come to those 7,000 pages.
that's correct.
With your kind of philosophical groundwork.
Mm-hmm.
How can they possibly hope to understand it? Is it simple enough to understand?
Yes, it is.
It is?
Yes. Would you like for me to read to you a sample from it?
Give me a sample.
How about the very first opening lines, Professor Galambos, His Theory of Freedom? Just a little sample here. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first session of V50, the basic course of the Free Enterprise Institute, and the one from which all progress thereafter stems. I'd like to point out that this first session may be quite different from all the others that will follow, because from my own personal standpoint, frankly, it's a very difficult session to teach. Probably the most difficult of any session of any course that I've ever taught, because I have to explain to you in this session what it's all about and what you're here for, and that's pretty hard to do in the framework of one session. The problem is that every person that is attending has obviously had many inputs in his life of many different kinds from many different sources, and they are in some respects similar to each other. You've all been living in the same culture, and you've had the same inputs from the standpoint of the political structure. How you react to it is individually different. Some of you may admire the present political structure and think that we're doing the best we can in a difficult situation. Others of you may realize that the problem is very great, and that not only not the best is being done, but if you try to do it in the worst of all possible manners, this is just about how you'd pick it. I would agree with the second group. However, I don't wish to alienate the first group, since before the end of the course, I suspect they will see what I mean by that. First of all, this is not actually the real beginning of the formal development of the theory of this course, and then he goes on. That's a sample of the opening. Let me give you one more, just quickly here. It deals with the second session, which has always been my favorite personally, because its subject title is so great. How do you know you are right? And here's how that begins. How do you know you are right? Now that's an obvious question that comes to mind in every realm of human endeavor and undertaking. Nevertheless, that question is usually sloughed off by most people as, well, that's a ridiculous question. I know I'm right because I'm doing the thinking. Who else would be right? Everybody imagines that whatever he thinks is naturally, automatically right, and it can't be any other way. Well, that isn't as simple as that, because the other fellow who disagrees with you has a similar attitude that he is right. He may happen to be in total disagreement with your position, and it's very difficult to demonstrate that two conflicting points of view are equally right. So, because this introduces a chronic and almost predictably universal situation in human affairs, there has gotten to be another attitude on the subject of rightness, which is even more prevalent. Well, obviously, rightness is relative. There is no such thing as right. It just depends on point of view, and everything is relative anyhow. So why bother trying to talk about who's right and who's wrong? It depends on the point of view. That, ladies and gentlemen, is why we have wars on a large scale and people punching each other in the nose on a small scale. So it's a fireside chat, you might almost say. It's got a homely touch to it. The voluminous writings are all necessary because there is an awful lot to know. And there are many delusions that man has to get rid of. And it's really not too much different from learning the theory of relativity. If you wanted to learn the theory of celestial mechanics, you would have to pay the price. And you're right. Your question seems to indicate that very few people will ever pay the price to become truly educated. But it is only those who are willing to pay that price who can become the true revolutionaries. And it's them, they who make these products that ultimately produce the wireless telegraph, the radio, and ultimately the television set, and all the rest that comes out in the electronic age.
Am I misunderstanding you? That this is a philosophy that it can act almost like a self-liberating philosophy?
Oh, most definitely. For those who hunger and thirst for it, this is the answer. You won't find it anywhere else.
And we're looking at a new kind of man.
Absolutely. Yes. A man who behaves morally all the time.
Without religious dogma.
That's
or
right.
the whip.
That's exactly right. And he will not do it because he understands the principles that are behind his behavior. Just as the man who's viewing the television set does not understand Maxwell's equations. He will do it because it is the custom, because it is profitable, because to not do it means an instantaneous loss of his property and great pain.
Properly applied, you foresee a society then, a minimalist society, minimalist intrusion by government? Is this man a libertarian? We would call him today a libertarian philosopher?
No, he's not a libertarian philosopher, and he detested the term. He said it was a weasel-worded term. He says the better word is liberal. And so what they've done is they've taken the word libertarian to distinguish themselves from the pseudo-liberals and haven't had the guts to retain the right word and to not acknowledge the theft. So he would be a liberal in the truest sense of the term. Liberal means ever pertaining to freedom. And I would say his philosophy is definitely not minimalist, because that implies that you're still tolerating to some degree an element of coercion in the form of the old traditional concept of a state. Falsely named the government, by the way. Government comes from the Latin gubernare, which means to steer and ultimately to protect private property. Well, I would say true governments would be an insurance company, a night watchman, your dog, a fence, a padlock. These are all services that are calculated in a very primitive way to protect private property. Ultimately, it'll be done electronically. It's already been, some of these technologies are already afoot in the world today. It's wondrous to see. It brings me back to the theory of spontaneous order, that the ideological demand for security will ultimately be met by a supply of proprietary governments, as I just defined them. Governments so potent that ultimately not all the technology in the world today for destruction will be able to prevail against it. Now that seems utopian, but I have to remind you that utopian comes from utopos, the Greek word which means no such place, therefore impossible. And if you define impossible as that which would have to violate a law of nature, then it is imperative upon the person who would call this utopian to demonstrate that there's some law of nature that this violates. But there is no known law of nature that this violates, and so therefore it remains possible. And that's very optimistic. We just have to look to science and to the history of science to see that it is very possible to become completely free. But we cannot rely in the smallest iota upon any assumption of the necessity of coercion, whether it be mystical in the religious sense or whether it be political in the secular sense. And that's the breakthrough. That's the tremendous, beautiful, revolutionary quality and flavor of this. And what really appealed to me in the beginning was that it was derivative of Archimedes and Newton, only it went beyond it and penetrated into the social domain. And it shouldn't be so surprising that this has never been done before. After all, we didn't have any real progress until after Newton, in any grand way that I illustrated, or as the professor illustrated, until about 300 years ago. In the overall context of history, recorded history, just 6,000 years, that's a blinking of an eye. It just happened. It took place in England, and Scotland, and Europe.
So finally, society would become predictable
Totally.
and therefore ultimately manageable, almost self-manageable.
It would be definitely self-manageable. And it would be predictable in the sense that it would evolve. It would be like a permanent bull market. And there would be really essentially nothing to stop it.
And
nothing at all.
aberrations really wouldn't be possible because it is rooted in firm scientific
Yes.
rules.
The technology is all of the technology of freedom would be valid. What do I mean by that? It would be valid in the sense that it would be derivative, logically, from the postulatory structure, otherwise known as the hypothesis of freedom. The hypothesis of freedom consists of two fundamental universal postulates. The first is that all men live to pursue happiness, and the second is that all concepts of happiness pursued through moral action are equally valid. And anything that violates either one of those postulates in the assumptions of a man's arguments or his system is therefore, we would call, invalid, unacceptable. It doesn't follow. And then, of course, history backs us up. It says, hey, anybody that assumes that coercion is necessary, that tax is necessary, that you have to have a state in order to have national defense, that you have to have a state to build roads, that you have to have a state in order to have education, is basically got an invalid argument because it doesn't follow from the postulatory structure of the new physics, which is essentially the extension of Newtonian physics or classical physics into the social domain, where there is nothing assumed and no method is employed, which is inconsistent with the tremendous history of success, the continuum of success that science has always had. Because even in science where you have a failed experiment, that's a growth in knowledge, and there is no failure there at all. Which reminds me of Thomas Alva Edison in his laboratory when they were trying to get the incandescent light bulb going, and I'd get 25,000 different experiments, and one day a forlorn assistant came to Edison and said, "My God, we've failed again." And Edison says, "Oh no, my young man, we now know something else that doesn't work." Please note the alteration in psychological perspective there. In perspective, you see why one is the great inventor or innovator and the other is just a laboratory assistant. So, yeah.
Did the professor ever speculate or draw a picture of what society would be once they have acknowledged his principles?
Sure. Universal control of private property. Really, basically, what shall I say, a projection and extrapolation of technology and human experience beyond this planet.
Did you talk about the role of money? What the role of money would be in this new
Money is
society?
huge, but it won't be the kind of money we got today. That's not money. He said that he defined money as any durable, divisible commodity having intrinsic value and universal appeal as a means of exchange. Well, hell, paper doesn't do that. You know, fiat currency doesn't do that. The monetary systems of the world have been destroyed. They don't exist anymore. We don't have money. It's called money. It's a medium of exchange, but it's not a money. Money has to be based upon integrity. which Galambos defines as the consistent, reliable, and predictable employment of moral behavior by one who is not subject to detection or even enforcement or even detection. So if you've got a monetary system which is anchored upon that great absolute principle, and you've got the technology to make it work, which he has in his courses here, among thousands of other subjects which are revolutionized, then yes, then the skids are greased and transactions will take place without any deception, without any inflation, without any debasement, no hidden taxes. Yes, money is very important.
So he touched upon that?
Oh yes, oh yes. He had a money seminar. It was sessions and sessions of it. It's glorious stuff. But he doesn't let you get to it until you've paid your dues. You've got to learn the philosophy and the semantics of the theory and understand how to think for the first time in your life on a rational basis. The man who brought me into the theory in 1964, I remember him asking me, the way it happened was this. I was a young guy trying to make a living in the estate planning insurance business, so I gave a pitch to a successful businessman, and when I got all through, he did the terrible thing of asking me who I was going to vote for. Well, you know, in selling, you're not supposed to ever talk about politics or religion, and here I go. I thought I'd done a hell of a job of selling the guy. And he comes back and says, who are you going to vote for? And I said, oh, well, it was this interview. So I said, Barry Goldwater. This is the year of 1964. And I thought that would cause him to lose because he lost by the largest margin in history, I believe, to Lyndon Baines Johnson, a real crook from Texas. And I remember he just looked at me, nonchalantly even, and he said, yeah, well, why? Then I said, well, let's see. Lenin stated that the morality of the Communist Party is dictated by the exigencies of the class struggle. In other words, it's a relative standard of morality. We of the Christian faith here in the United States, which I believe then it was a Christian nation, I believe that once you give your word, you keep it, even if it's to your advantage. In other words, our morality is absolute, not relative, certainly not dependent upon or relative to the class struggle. And Mr. Lyndon Baines Johnson is going about these days as a presidential aspirant saying that we should peacefully coexist with the Russians. Now that makes him a damn traitor, or he's unbelievably stupid. Neither of which commends him to be the president of our United States. On the other hand, Mr. Goldwater says that's not possible. You cannot peacefully coexist with the Russians. And on that issue alone, I cast my vote for Goldwater. I thought I did a hell of a job. I thought it was a great answer. And I'll never forget it. The man looked at me and he said, well, supposing that you win and Mr. Goldwater becomes the President of the United States, how do you know that all this is right? And I don't mean right on a relativistic basis. I mean on an absolute basis. And he paused, he stopped, and he waited for me to answer. Now I thought I was a pretty good hotshot in those days. I was puffed up with knowledge. I'd read the class he said. I was 28 years old then. I was a pretty smart boy, I thought. And but I had the intellectual honesty on that occasion. I'm very proud of this. And I said, well, to myself, my God, what a great question. So I said, and he saw me deliberating. He said, well, do you find that question philosophically provocative? And I said, I do. He said, would you like to know where that comes from? And I said, where does it come from? And he said, it comes from a great innovator who has integrated volition with classical physics, which makes it possible for the first time in human history for mankind to become free. And just in time, because we now have our terminal crisis. We have enough technology to wipe ourselves out on many different fronts many times over, and we don't have the technology to prevent that from happening. Do you find my question philosophically provocative? And I said, absolutely. He says, and I don't mean absolutely right on just some things, like politics, but absolutely right in all things. I went, whoa, what crust, you know. And I said, well, yes, I do. But I remember my heart was pounding. I'd never been confronted with such profundity like that before, and such an intense look. And so he said, well, are you interested in hearing where that comes from? It comes from an astrophysicist who got sick of the state of the world and decided that he was going to make the world safe for astrophysicists, and in the process he found out that it was a universal theory. It applies to everyone. And he said, so this does not come from the traditional sources, politics or religion or anything else. This is coming from the Newtonian integration 300 years ago, which I did not know about then, not much. And I heard it, and I said, oh boy, this is meat. So he pulled out of his top drawer an enrollment form, and it cost $50. A lot of money for me. I borrowed the $50 from my father to take the course, and I paid for it, not in installments. And that was on September 28, 1964, when I heard the great, great session, How Do You Know You're Right? And that evening when I left, at about 11 o'clock, I think it was, yeah, and I drove home, I floated home. I couldn't believe it. I could hardly go to sleep. It was like Paul's vision on the road to Damascus. It was a non-theological rebirth. I was born again. What I had come from was darkness into light. And that's an infinite increase in knowledge. There can never be a more exhilarating experience than that. It can be likened to a man sitting in a cave that's completely hermetically sealed off from all light. He can't even see anything. He can only feel his face. He knows his contours. And then somehow, you could bring a small candle and light it up. And although the outlines of the cave would be dim, but they could be discernible. And for the first time in his life, the blind man sees. Now, if you add another candle to that one candle, you do double the luminous output. And that's pretty dramatic. Or now two more, and then 4 more, and then 8 more, and then 16 more, keeping it doubling up the luminous output and the psychological payoff you get from that. But it'll never match that initial going from darkness to something light, which is an infinite increase. And that's what happened to me that night. But in all the years since, I've been wise enough, thanks to Professor Galambos, who's taught me everything I'm saying today, and it's in all these books. I've learned that you have to hold your feet to the fire, because you might be receiving on page 2000 1,500 light bulbs or candles worth of light. But the vast amount of luminous output of your knowledge at that point is so great you can't even tell that there's been an increase. And you have to be very careful you don't become disillusioned because you're not getting the same psychological
buzz.
Joy or buzz, yeah. And so I realized that. That's called the law of logarithmic stimulation. It's a great law. Two great German physicists, one was Weber and one was Fechner. It's called the Weber-Fechner law. Pointed out that there's a physiological point of no return. I mean, when you can't tell it. If you have 100 pounds of weight and you're holding it in your hand, and you add one plate that's worth 10 pounds, you can't tell that it's been added. The stress is too great. But if you reverse that and you go down to 10 plates and you add one each a pound, then add another plate of a pound, you'll notice the difference. I said 10 pounds to the 100. I didn't mean that. That was the ratio being kept. That was wrong. You add 1 plate, 1 pound to it, you can't tell the difference. And the same thing goes psychologically. I just gave the example here. So you have to be aware of the law of logarithmic stimulation. And
so it's not that you become jaded as you study.
Not at all.
It is because you have learned so much that, and you are illuminated so much that one more candle ain't making a difference, right?
It doesn't make a difference. I can't tell it, but I sure do welcome it.
And there you go. That's it. Yeah.
And that comes back to the philosophy business here. That it's a very important one, and it is that all knowledge. No knowledge is wasted. Everything is important. Mm-hmm. You know, when I was growing up, I was a Christian boy, and I was in a very fundamentalist church, Church of Christ, and I was taught that you don't go by anything other than the Scriptures. Wonderful training for me. And what divides men today in Christendom is not what the Bible teaches, but what it doesn't teach. Mm-hmm. And so I studied the Scriptures, and I learned a lot. I remember one great one in here was Jesus was writing to the church of Philadelphia through his angel John. It's in the book of Revelation. he praised them. He praised them for their steadfastness and their courage and their loyalty and their morality, etc., etc. I mean, my goodness, I've never been to any congregation in Christendom where anybody could match up to that. And yet he said, and this is valuable, it's very, very valuable for your work and my work and all of us who count. And that is, he said, but I have one thing against thee. Thou hast fallen away from your first love. Repent, or I will come and remove the lampstand that is in your midst. In other words, you can't go on automatic. You gotta keep alive, man. So I cultivate that all my days of my life, and I'm a living testimony to it, and obviously the professor saw at the end that I was his man. And he chose me, and it's a sacred thing. I feel like I'm sort of the, what shall I say, I have to dedicate everything I'm doing to this. And it has to be promulgated under the right terms. It cannot be disclosed promiscuously. Not until his book is out will the cosmological portions of his theory be disclosable to the rest of the world. And but as soon as they are, and I will be finished with this book sometime in the spring, next year, then everything I'm saying here is definitely releasable. And for those in your market who can in some way, at some point in this interview, be stimulated as I was by the man who challenged me about who I was going to vote for, then they have a chance at life. And this is what lies beyond the great struggle we're up against now. We prevail in that. The while beginning to build these technologies as the state disintegrates. We don't fight the state. It will accommodate us in its suicide. We need the principles, we need the ideological background, we need the postulates, we need the method in order to build a gradual movement of dedicated, educated by the definition I gave. I repeat, education is a successful transmission of absolutely right concepts to those who not only can understand them but will apply them in the real world. The real world is derived from absolute rightness, which I didn't define, and I'll give it to you now. Absolute rightness. The standard of absolute rightness, the, what shall I say, the standard bearer is rationality, defined as the use of the scientific method in arriving at conclusions. That's rationality. It consists of truth and validity. Truth in the first step, you deal with truth in the first step of the scientific method, it's observation for the purpose of gathering data. And you're using truth again in the fourth step of the scientific method, but this time to corroborate your extrapolations. In the second and third steps of the scientific method, you're using validity. Validity is the subject that deals with the rules of logic. In the second step of the scientific method, when you're formulating your hypothesis, you're dealing with inductive logic primarily, some deductive. And then when you go into the third step, or extrapolation, you're projecting, that's what the word means, you're using deductive logic. So truth and validity working together successfully through the scientific methods, 4 steps, produce an output results or conclusions, and ultimately technologies, which have no exception. I mean, they do not fail, they work. And nature will ultimately reward those experiments as it repeals those which are irrational. And when you couple that with morality, that is to say, non-coercive behavior, that is to say, behavior which does not involve any intentional and attempted interference with the property of another, as your guide in rescuing mankind from the clutches of doomsday, then you have a chance at the deal. And then all you have to do is look at all your institutions you're creating to see whether they are valid. It's very simple to do. You just say, is there any coercion involved in this, or isn't there? And with the scientific method at your disposal, you can rectify your problems and you can go a long way. And that's what we need.
What I see here then is, this is a handbook for creating order out of chaos.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I mean, congratulations for that observation. But again, I repeat, this is not for the masses. It is for the Hertzes and the Marconis and the Flemings and the Edisons and the Teslas of the world. It's not for the. It is for the. It's for the Vanderbilts, the great entrepreneurs, the great builders of industries. They will need what's in here to know how to pay gratitude to innovators. The great success of this theory, and what makes the difference, is it recognizes that the source of all man's problems is that there's been a tremendous barrier between the disclosure of innovations and ideas by the discoverers and the inventors and the rest of the world. The businessmen have stolen their ideas and not paid for it. They think that upon disclosure, that knowledge is donated to the communist warehouse of ideas. And that's no good, because what happens is the innovators lose control of their ideas, and the rascals of the earth get a hold of them and pervert them and convert great tools into weapons. And now we have, instead of spears and later cannons even, but now we've got nuclear warfare. And it's all because the innovators lost control of their property. We need technology to integrate primary property, or the property and thoughts and ideas and actions, with secondary or tangible properties and money and all that. And when you get that, you get the technology clearinghouse that makes that possible for that proper dissemination of this knowledge. Then, by God, you've got the solution.
You'll be up and away.
You bet. And I love the story that Galambos used to tell about the Father and the Son in the distant galaxy. I didn't believe that. I would love to roam this universe. I hope I'll never live to see it, I'm sure. But boy, will they look back upon us.
I wouldn't be so sure.
Yeah. You hold it open. What law of nature would violate that? I don't know if I could identify one, therefore we can't say it's impossible.
Dream the impossible dream.
Yeah, right. With quotes around impossible.
There you go.
You know, I'll tell you what is impossible. The resolution of societal ills by means of politics. That is impossible. That is impossible. And nature has shown us that over and over. Scientific method tells us that all political experiments will fail. They have no other possibility. So, and religion is not the solution. I mean, obviously, it's for another world. By the way, religion, I'm not coming down that hard on it. I'm just saying religion has to do with metaphysics. Metaphysics means beyond physics. We're just talking about the physical world here now. We're not talking about metaphysics. Yeah, this is the way. Ask yourself the question, what are all the things you like in the world? You like automobiles, you like refrigerators, you like television, you like good food, you like
hot showers.
Shoot, yeah, central heat. We could go on and on.
Sure.
What do we dislike? I'll tell you what we dislike. Everything that comes from the state. Taxes, inflation, wars, ruination of culture.
Speeding tickets, traffic.
Yeah, you name it. Build those two lists and ask yourself the question. All the good things in my life come from what source? Trace that back and you'll find out that it comes first from discovery, then from invention, then from the marketing of these things, all through voluntary processes. It's the market economy. With one little extra addition, and that is all important addition. It's that the market economy is headed up by the ones who really count in this world, and that's the intellectuals. I don't mean intellectuals at the college level. I don't mean these bird-brained professors that spout socialism. I'm talking in relativism and nihilism and sociology. I'm talking about the real intellectuals, the Newtons, the Galileos, the Archimedeses, the great inventors, unnamed, unsung, and unwept. That's...
You know, what thought has struck me throughout this entire discourse by you, and what was supposed to be an interview, basically, was the definition of insanity is to repeat the same thing over and over again and then expect different results. Because that's really what we have to do.
Oh, that's excellent. Would you like to know how Professor Galambos defined it?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think it's incompatible with yours. He said it's the consistent, reliable, and predictable employment of irrational behavior. Erratic behavior, irrational behavior. Well, by that definition, I would say the whole world is insane today. It subscribes to suicidal policies.
And it's evident everywhere.
And it's evident everywhere. Look at the youth today. They are lost, they're gone. It's as though you're speaking to inmates in a lunatic asylum. You can't reach them. They have no basis for thinking and communication, at least the ones I've met out here in California. There are probably some pockets of pretty good ones. We've got a couple of good ones right here in my staff here. But, yeah, it's the world is insane. I mean, think about it. If you were a highly cultured alien civilization and you or your automatons or you yourselves, who knows, could pass by the planet Earth, now improperly named, or monitor the electromagnetic waves that are being propagated day and night for centuries, for I don't know, decades off the planet Earth and monitor the silly crap that comes out of television. Why? You would despair of ever trying to land here or do any business with them. And one of the most offensive shows they'd see would be Star Wars and Space Wars and crap like that. I mean, how can it possibly be? I mean, if a civilization has been able to overcome coercion and do the things I'm talking about here, and by the way, this theory is not confined to this Earth, it's all over this goddamn universe. If that happens, and they come and they see that, they'll say, we'll pass on that. That's not a profitable opportunity there. And and let's assume we have the technology to go out and try to do business with them. I mean, to do damage to them, you know, like terrible space aliens. Why, hell, they'll snuff us out like a pest, and we won't even know what happened to us, and that scares the hell out of me.
Yeah.
They say, well, these flies are buzzing in our ears, and we're gone, and it won't be even immoral. It'll simply be defense. They're getting rid of pests, and that's the world we live in today. It's disgusting. And I'm looking for young people. I'm looking for young people with a lot of treadwear left. I don't have that much. I'm 63 now, going on 64 next month.
You got lots left.
I know, but I don't have as much treadwear as the young ones. And if I could get some young people to dedicate and consecrate their lives to building freedom, and build a division of labor there, oh my God, with the potency of this, that will produce, as I said earlier, the new majority.
From what I have seen and observed since I came down here, you have been a good teacher.
Yes, I have. I have had many people come my way. But ultimately, it has to be reduced to writing. And when I'm through with this, I'll go on to my own writing and teaching. We will have a hell of a life. There's still much to live for. And I'm always able to get the young people to stop all their arguments and listen when I say, shut up. You don't know anything. Listen to me. I'm an old man, and I'm wise with the years. Your life is wretched. You are miserable, and you know it. You don't know anything. You have no purpose. You have no zeal. You ache inside, and you're dying. Shut up and listen to your elders. And they do. They really will. I've had women come into here, feminists, you know, spouting the usual feminist crap where they say that they don't want to have kids and the home is dehumanizing, and I say, shut up, be quiet. If you're going to speak to me, speak from your own mind and quit repeating the platitudes and cliches. You're so alienated from your basic instinct that unless you be quiet and start over again, after about 3 years I can bring you up to ground zero. I can bring you up to nothing, and then from there we can have a positive chance at the deal. Because they have to undo so many bad things that they've learned. Again, the criterion of absolute rightness is rationality plus morality, or put another way, truth plus validity plus morality. You stick to those 3 simple parameters, and you've got it made, boy. And you can test everything with that, and you can retain the good and eschew what is wrong. What a liberating thing that is. What a fantastically liberating, beautiful coin of vantage that is. And the world has never had it until now. Never before. You can search all through your philosophy books and your history books. You can read all your textbooks, I don't care, your novels, you can read everything. You can even read the founding fathers of the United States. They were close. It was a near encounter with freedom. But a near encounter with freedom is like 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 degrees off. Then at the lapse of decades, it becomes a catastrophe, which is exactly what has happened in this country. I do not believe in democracy, spelled with a capital D. That's political democracy, which is a sham. That is the ultimate weapon of what Irving says is our traditional enemy. Nor do I believe in republics, which is another one of their inventions. A republic is a rule of law. What's the law? A flimsily worded constitution, which in subsequent decades, when the time is propitious, they will reinterpret, which will ultimately lead to democracy, and democracy is the end of civilization. And our founding forefathers knew that. In the 10th Federalist paper, Madison wrote about that. said democracy is short-lived, it's brutal, and it's disastrous, and it's the most horrible thing you can imagine. So I don't believe in democracy. I certainly don't believe in republics, which are better. It's a little interregnum between the monarchy and rule of the people, which is an uncorroborable myth. If I had to have my choice politically, I would pick a king. The kings of yesteryear knew how to protect their people. A leader. But it doesn't work. It has the wrong philosophical foundations. No, we have to grow up now and begin again. And we begin with the theory of freedom, which is the great integration between volition and physics. They're now unified now, using the same epistemology. People have asked me, well, how can you take the volitional concept of morality and render that amenable to the scientific method? And the answer is clear. In the second step, sir, in the second step of the scientific method, you formulate an hypothesis. In the formulating of your hypothesis, there's nothing that says you cannot use a principle instead of a law in order to derive a world that does not yet exist, but could. So when you take the concept of morality and incorporate that into the second postulate, you have just integrated at that point the concept of volition with the concept of classical physics, which deals with inanimate objects, where you can have mathematical prediction and accuracy along with semantic precision. Here, we don't need the prediction. We don't need the accuracy, however much it might be desired whenever it offers itself. But you can have the precision, and the precision is all that is necessary in order to use the scientific method to derive valid consequences or output conclusions, which, if corroborable, and if they prove satisfactory in all cases, then you have just done it. You've shown how you can integrate the use of the scientific method beyond inanimate and even animate physics to volitional physics, which is a subcase of biology, which is a subcase of the big show, physics, which is the ultimate and grand and all-powerful subject. But now volition is subsumed under the overall grand subject of physics. That's how magnificent this is. That's how grand it is. And that's how revolutionary it is. People ask me, do we have time? Oh, there's a $64,000 question of all time, of all history. My God, it never was a question more poignant than that one. Do we have time? Probably not. That should make us get up and be a doing all the more. And if we don't win, what a victory we've had anyway.
So you speak with the eloquence of emergency.
Yes. There is an emergency now. It's so critical. It is so critical that we are truly facing the extermination of our species. Why? We couldn't heal ourselves of our ancient insanity. It boils down to that. I like your definition. Couldn't learn from the past. Who was it? Was it Hegel who said, or was it Santa Anna? Santa Anna, yeah. Who said, if a man does not learn from the past, he's destined to repeat it. I disagree. And I agree. Hear me on this. It shows you how poorly the philosopher Santa Anna thought, because he didn't have this real philosophy. I agree, Mr. Santa Anna. In the area of politics, and in the area of religion, because they don't have the self-rectifying methodology here. They didn't learn the lessons from positive history, the history of scientific achievement, as distinguished from negative history, the history of political destruction of property. Science is the creation of property. So is the market economy. When it's unhampered, it's the creation of property. And he's wrong in this. He's right in the sense of politics and religion. He is wrong when it comes to science. Because the whole history of science shows how we learn from the mistakes of the past. And we learn from the triumphs of the past. You all know the phlogiston hypothesis of heat. They believed heat was a material object. Many men, great men, wonderful men, devoted their entire lives to the phlogiston hypothesis. That turned out to be wrong. Gosh, what a tragedy. And yet it isn't a tragedy, because of the great principle of philosophy that says no knowledge is wasted. It was one of those things in science. Well, we know what isn't. We know what is wrong, and we can live by that and not repeat it. The scientific method says if you have 1,000 experiments, and they are all corroborated, and on the 1,001st experiment, you're refuted, what do? Do you have an ad hoc approach to this? Do you shove it under the rug? As the politicians do with 49% of all the people that voted against them, you just shove it under the rug. I'm right. I got a 51% vote. No, in science, you have a very rigorous procedure here. It says if you flunk on the first, you have to scrap your hypothesis. You start over again, or you figure out where were you wrong in your extrapolation. Your postulatory structure may be absolutely valid and true, therefore rational, but your logic getting from there to this experiment wasn't accurate. You'd be able to take something into consideration, or your thinking didn't quite square up with the rules of deductive logic. But in either case, you can't tolerate that one failure. Now you may say that's a very harsh criterion. Well, perhaps so, but that's how we cure diseases. That's how we build bridges. That's how we got to the moon. And that is not how we got into the current political mess we're in today. And people need to wake up and see this. And nowhere is this taught anywhere in the colleges. Nowhere is this taught in the universities. It's not taught in the magazines. You can't go to any bookstore. You can't get it anywhere. You get it through what I would call the underground press. You've got to go where men chase the holy grail of knowledge and travel light. They will sacrifice everything for it. I remember when I was a young boy and I read the great Beatitudes. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness' sake, for they shall be filled. Ask and ye shall receive. And I truly do believe that. I believe that is true. I think we can program our subconscious minds to deliver all manner of divine results for us. I remember a few years ago, how many was it, boys? It was 3 years ago. What did you say? Mm-hmm. And it sounds almost naive and childish, but I'll tell you what it is. I said, I discovered God today. All my life I've been searching after God, and I think I have found it. You know, Galambos defines God as the source of all natural phenomena, and I don't necessarily see any reason to reject that. But from the standpoint of the volitional God that we've all traditionally been exposed to, I finally found God. And here was I had a dream. I dreamed that I was dreaming about Stone Age creatures that were living in southern France or Spain, in the cave where they did all the cave writings. And I was impressed by those writings, those beautiful paintings of those horses. And I woke up impressed with my dream, and I basked in the emotion of it. And then all of a sudden it dawned on me, I says, my God, you know, wherever man has been, prehistory and otherwise, and some post-history, or during historical times, regardless of whether they were geographically remote, regardless of the distance in time and space, man is always attributed to some supernal force or forces, both for good and for evil, the ultimate determination of their fates. That's interesting. It's like Newton said, you know, people said, well, how can you have action at a distance? Where is the string or the cable that holds the moon to the earth and the earth to the sun? It's inconceivable that there could be such a thing as an action at a distance without some medium. Well, ultimately, the field theories cleared that up. So what is the field that connects us up with all these various races so that we all believe in gods or gods, goddesses, and so on? There has to be some unifying field theory. And I says, what the hell is it? I think I got it. All the gods and goddesses and all of the externalities, all the great supernal powers external to man, are but the poetic expressions of his, till then, undiscovered subconscious mind. That vast tool that records every datum, every second of your existence, which remembers everything. So it's like omniscient, huh? Can you tap into it? Well, under hypnosis you can, I know that. Boy, I mean down to the smallest detail. The polka dot dress your mother was wearing when you were 5 years old, cooking breakfast that morning. You can remember it all. And they've corroborated this sort of thing. So you have this vast Library of Congress you're walking around with. It has every conversation, every book, every movie, every experience, everything you've ever been exposed to in your whole life. It's all there. So you're like omniscient in a sense. How about omnipresent? Well, you've just, as Edwin Gibbon said in Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 1, he said that the distinction between the savage and the man of culture is the man of culture reflects and reads. And by so doing, he multiplies his experience by traveling to distant countries at remote ages. All right, so yeah, I travel to distant ages at remote countries. What the hell? I have an indefinable rapport with the ancient Greeks now. I can't give you exact details of the battles of the Thucydides Peloponnesian War, but I read it. It's there. It's very there for me to use. So I'm sort of omnipresent. These are all divine characteristics, by the way. Here's the integration I made. And then I said, okay, there's one other thing. Let's see. There's omniscience. All-knowing, all-power, omnipotent. And in a sense, I can be all-powerful if I will but access this fantastic force, this servo mechanism within me. My God. And then a passage from the Bible came to me. And I rehearsed it from heart, which is a poetic expression of exactly this very same thing, which is, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they do comfort me. Thou preparest a table for me before mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Take out the Lord, take out the mysticism, and you got what you got here. You can do incredible things. I was trying to figure out in a biography that I was writing, why doesn't it live? I have all the background material, I've done all my research, they're beautifully crafted sentences, I'm eloquent as hell, and yet it doesn't live. What is missing? And I couldn't get the answer. And I was filled with despair and frustration. I says, maybe I'm one of those guys that's destined never to be articulate or eloquent. Can't pull it off. I can't infect somebody with the emotion that I've got, which is the definition of art that Tolstoy gave us. I can't infect myself with it. And then I remembered, oh! And I prayed. The Bible says pray unceasingly. So I went within and I said, dear holy subconscious mind of mine, go God, be power within me. Give me my answer. I'm through intellectualizing this crap. I'm not going to work today. I'm going to put my shoes on. I'm going to grab my surfboard and paddle out, and I'm just going to be a beach bum until you give me the answer, and I know you'll give it to me. Hell, I did. I canceled appointments. I went around barefoot. I was a bum. Didn't take a shower. I just completely let go. I just totally relaxed. And then one day I was wandering around barefoot. My wife was shopping. I was down in the downstairs den, and I walked by and I saw one of my library shelves, and then I just was unconscious, totally relaxed, at peace with the world, and totally trusting. But I wasn't thinking about the God that He was working down in here. So I found a book. I don't think I've got it here. I don't. It's at home. It was a brown book, and the title had worn off of it. And I just look at it, and I pulled it out, and I was thumbing through it, and it was Henri Troyat's biography of Tolstoy's life, one of the great biographies I've read. I was thumbing through it and just not thinking or anything, and I came to a page, I think it was page 218, somewhere along in there, about a little bit this side of the middle of the book. And I turned and I looked on this page, and in blue ink, written in 1971, August 18th, 1971, I wrote in the margin, my God, this is unbelievable. You know, and I looked, and it was a passage. Tolstoy had the same problem. He was writing War and Peace. And he wrote to the only critic in Russia that he liked, he could trust, because he was always criticizing him. So he could trust him, and they were very good friends. And here's how it went. The critic wrote back to him and says, Tolstoy had written to him and said, tell me what you think. I want to burn the book. It's no good. I'm at wit's end. I'm at a loss. And the critic writes back and says, well, it's beautifully written. You have done magnificent historical research. The background is impeccable. The only problem is, Lev, your characters have no movement. And Tolstoy writes back, "This is my God." Yeah, that's it. And that's all I read. But I thought that was tremendous in 1971. And I read that and I said, "Oh, that's very interesting." You know, it didn't dawn on me. I had gotten my answer. So I put the book back and I started reflecting on it. Went around through the kitchen, went out the hallway, went up the stairs to my den. And I was about halfway up on the landing of my house there. And I did a little jig. Oh my God! Oh my God! And tears came to my eyes. I says, you knew where that was. It took you 2.5 days maybe, or maybe I wasn't paying attention to you, to find that page where the answer was there for me. And you can't talk, my dear right brain, but you knew what to do to position me and get me where I could find the answer. And you knew exactly what page it was. And I don't know, subconsciously, I was being driven. It was like a guardian angel, but it's within, not without. Then I turned to the page, I read it, and I got my answer. So I went up to my book. This is unbelievable. I went to the passage, and I says, "Well, hell, movement, huh? Movement, huh? Let's see. I'll have him wipe his ass. Oh, no. I'll make him move. Get up out of a chair. It didn't matter. Just get him to move." And all of a sudden, the passage came alive for me. And I tell that true story. To illustrate that there's all kinds of unbelievable potential for us if we will but trust to this incredible servo mechanism within us that remembers everything. And it's like, ask and ye shall receive. All these scriptural passages are there to instruct us on how to access these divine powers which will make us walk through the valley of the shadow of death with no necessity to be stressed out or to experience fear over the slings and arrows we all get in the valley of death, which is life. And we welcome it. Like David, who could walk up before Goliath and dispatch him. Boy, talk about control of the subconscious there. He knew he was going to do it. Or Babe Ruth, to draw eclectically from so many different sources. No knowledge is wasted. Babe Ruth, as a young boy, a teenager, was dared to throw a baseball through an open hole in a Catholic church window. There had been a hole in it. And he bet all the kids on the playground he could do it. Cocky Babe Ruth, the great Bambino. Picks the ball up, unconscious. That's the key. Throws the ball right through the damn thing. If he'd thought about it for a split second, he would have missed, boy. And all the great athletes, great actors, great people are basically always reducing what they have to deliberate over to habit. The old Spanish proverb says, habits are at first cobwebs, then cables. God, I love that one. And if you can reduce what you have to think about instead of reinventing the damn thing all over and over and over again, you just reduce it to habit by living it. Ultimately, you get this big flywheel effect in you. My God, it's like momentum. And when you're not motivated, either by your goals or by your dissatisfaction with the status quo, you'll still be on the right and true path because you're unipurpose dedicated. It's a beautiful thing. And this kind of stuff I'm sharing with you here very discursively has got pearls galore. And young kids, if they listen to this, they can pull some of this stuff out of here, even anybody. They're going to be able to enhance their life, because I've always said about myself that I am the way, the truth, and the life. That no one cometh to the Father, or in this case freedom, but by me. It's an attitude that I encourage everybody to believe in and to go by, because they've got the same power. It's a beautiful thing. And that's why I think we were brought together, because we're both the same kind of guys. Passionately, we go to the wall for what we believe in, all the way. Doesn't matter. Take those risks. I do believe I'm divinely inspired. Not in any mystical sense, not in any sense that can't be corroborated and substantiated through the use of the scientific, because to me, if somebody were to ask me, for example, and I've been asked, do you believe in the Holocaust? And my answer is no, of course not. And the answer, they say, oh, you don't believe in that? I says, no, because I only believe in that which can be substantiated by the scientific method. It has to be observably corroborable. The arguments of it have to follow logically, and then the output conclusions have to be corroborated. And I say the same thing about politics, say the same about anything. I don't believe in the Trinity. I don't believe I don't believe in the Nicene Creed. Why? Because it's not corroborable. It's simple as that. Do I believe in immortality? No. If you mean in the physical sense, no. There's no reason to. I have no evidence for it. But I don't disbelieve that I could live forever. I don't throw that out because I can't corroborate the non-existence of something. So I'm open. Trouble is, the world we live in today is so benighted. It's so lost that it's positively frightening, except if you remember the Maxwell story. Now the question is, do we have, it'll take a full generation to revolutionize the behavior and among a few, the thinking, so that we can get the show on the road here in terms of salvaging things. Continuing, if you will, so to speak, in a way, I guess, the American Revolution. They got so close. They got rid of the monarch. And for a while, you know, the United States had no government. Boy, were they prospering. Oh, boy. Boy, were they prospering. I mean, John Hancock's father, I forget his first name, but he was called the Prince of Smugglers. And smuggling is no crime. By the way, definition of crime, successful coercion. That's an absolute. Legal crime, not the same thing. It's relative. It's the concept of crime. If you define coercion as the attempted intentional interference of property, and property as an individual's life and all the non-procreative derivatives thereof, then you can come back to crime and say, well, crime then would be an attempt with intent to interfere with somebody else's property that has succeeded. And if it has succeeded, that's a crime. Therefore, the entire political structure today is criminal. By definition, it follows. And so is just about everything we experience. I tell people today, I says, listen, everything you've ever learned in your whole life is wrong. You need to start over again. Somebody says, well, what about physics? Isn't that an educational subject? Doesn't it fit your definition? Yeah. But if you don't teach the history and the philosophy of physics, what will happen to you? You'll know equations. You'll know the content of the subject. But you'll be as blind as a bat with respect to what other philosophy that made that possible, and certainly that you won't have any sense of patriotism for your great benefactors that made it possible. And as a result of that, you will wind up a busy little bee working for the common doom of mankind. You will be a flunky of the state, or of some goddamn university, or some charitable organization, and you won't be locked into proprietary ventures. And the reason you won't be locked into proprietary ventures is the damn guys that run the proprietary ventures don't believe in primary property. They don't pay royalties. They don't pay for the use of this stuff. So, you know, at the proverbial cocktail party or at the banqueting dinner on a cruise ship, I inevitably get asked the question, what do you do for a living? And I have many answers. One of them is, I said, I'm a professor. They say, oh, professor, what university do you teach at? I says, oh, well, concepts are mutually exclusive. I profess many things. And I've been known to charge for it. I make a lot of money. Or I'll say, I'm a government agent. Oh, CIA, and I'll say, oh no, the CIA is an arm of, a coercive arm of the state. Don't you know the difference between government and state? State is a monopoly on coercion with legal sanction. And a government is a proprietary service whose object is to protect private property. And it's voluntarily offered to a voluntary subscribing patronage. You know, semantics is powerful stuff, boy. I remember one time some guy said to me, he says, he used the word power in a derogatory sense. And I said, well, is that the extent of your understanding of the definition of power? Yeah. And I said, well, how about this for a definition? Power is control over actions. Now that can be coercive or immoral, or it can be non-coercive, moral. Let me ask you a question. Does Archimedes control your actions today? Does Newton control your actions today? How about Tesla, who gave us alternating current? How about Edison? He got that damn dynamo going. You think they control your life? How about Maxwell? Does Maxwell control your life today? He's got a long reach, you know. And I can finally, if they're dim-witted, you can finally get them to understand it. And they say, yeah. I say, okay, good. When did they ever coerce you? So there's moral power and there's immoral power. And you didn't make the distinction. And I got a better definition than yours. What do you say you join my thinking? You know? Mm-hmm. And I think that out there in the world, there's got to be the remnant. We're hungry and thirsty. I mean, we're not unique, I don't think. I mean, there's plenty of potential great men. They're lost. They're at sea. And my heart goes out for them, and that's why I'm doing this. But this will never reach the masses. This is for the progeny that must come first. Before then, you can get the prototype products that emerge from those who can understand the theoretical teachings in here and the technologies that are in here. In that order. And always remember the story of, I just picked almost a story about the television set, you know. It's kind of, he likes to tell the stories. This television guy comes to your door and wants to sell you a television set. And he says, all right, now this is called a television set, and before you can buy this, I'm going to have to put you through a 16-year course on electromagnetic wave propagation theory. And they'll say, get lost, Mac. No, he doesn't do that. He says, would you like to watch the Academy Awards in your living room? Be at bat with a home run slugger? Would you like to watch a movie? And can you count? Oh, you can count. Good. Okay, well, see, this is called a TV guide here, and you can correlate with these numbers of channels here with the numbers on your TV set, and you can shows you the time here, and then you can program your TV viewing for the week. And look at this. Oh, look at this beautiful, shiny mahogany. Look at this nice screen, and all these pretty doodads and bulbs and stuff, dials. And the wife says, "Oh, honey, how much does it cost?" Guy says, "Oh, it costs you so much. We put it on time payments for you." Man, that sounds so. Same thing with cars. They don't teach you thermodynamics to understand the internal combustion heat engine that drives the damn thing, or the vulcanization of rubber that makes those tires roll. No, they sell the sizzle. They sell the images, which I was doing for many years. But this is different. This is way up the hot end here. But this is where all great revolutions take place. Remember, Lenin, what he did. He wanted guys on furlough from death. He wanted just a few, and with a few, boy, you can move mountains. And that's the whole moral of the story here. As far as selling my stuff, I got to bring it down to a different level than this. This will never sell to the masses. So that probably gives you a pretty good overview of what we're talking about. I could go on for hours and hours and hours. I mean, Jesus Christ, I could talk for weeks.
We got the essence, I think. Have you got some pictures of the professor that I could film that we could intersperse someplace? Any photos?
No, I don't. He was very not remiss. He was opposed to that. He was not a vain man. He was afraid that photographs, he just wasn't big on the idea. There are some, but in deference to the man, it probably is better, at least for now, that we don't embarrass him.
Okay.
And that's not to say we can't in time.
You're his executor. You make the decision.
And again, what I've shared with you is not to be promiscuous before he can be heard.
Until you decide.
And here's the deal. Once these books are out, everything I've said, everything, is free for the disclosure. Until we'll be done. We're zeroing in on that. We'll be done probably, I say, count it, sometime around March, I think. We may have some cleanup work to do, but I'll be in touch with you. You can be in touch with me. And then edit this and pick out the stuff that there's a lot of stuff that was discursive and all over the place, but there will be stuff that can be used.
Very interesting.
Yeah. And I don't know how we can organize it. Maybe I can help you on that.
I'm glad we had this time. Yeah. Very good.
Yeah.
By the way, Dr. Walter Penfield in Montreal.
Yes.
Great neurosurgeon, expert in the brain. He totally, of course, corroborates what you're saying about the subconscious.
Really?
Oh yeah, we used to open up the brains of subjects with operations.
While they were alive?
hardware, like attach electrodes directly. They came up speaking languages that they never knew they could speak.
See, it's there.
Yeah, ancient languages.
Really?
They tape recorded those things in the 60s. He's dead now, but that was his work. And I mean, the great one, I'll call him, totally subscribed to this idea of going within and tapping plugging into the universal consciousness.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, see, I think that anybody that thinks
Before
that's
he went
gifted,
to,
they come to the same conclusions.
before he went to war against the Soviet Union, he spent 8 days on a fast up in his eagle's nest. Lost 10 pounds. Meditating.
Made us what?
Meditating.
Yeah. Yeah.
Should
Like
he-
Jesus
should
in the
he-
wilderness.
How would he, all that. And then I believe what happened is that Morel, his doctor, was an Allied agent. And he kept injecting him with compounds that were manufactured in the United States, barbiturates, mind-altering drugs. That's right. And Morel bragged in 1945 to a British intelligence officer that he decided, for instance, the Battle of Kursk, the greatest tank battle of the Second World War,
Yeah.
by an injection he gave him. So it was a deliberate
Oh, yeah.
action by Allied spies or
Sure.
traitors or infiltrators.
Sure. And his general staff are rotten to the core. Have you read David Irving's biography of Goebbels? How do you say Goebbels? Did I say it?
Goebbels.
Am I fairly close?
But
Yeah.
you see, so this is, I think that this is eternal truth. We can tap in, and one of the reasons why I never, ever went for drugs of any kind
Right.
was that I wanted to, quite early in my life I realized, that my dad was an alcoholic, and so I saw addiction.
ravages of
Yes,
that, yeah.
the ravages of addiction, and so I